I don't think actually a theocratic Iran can be contained even without nuclear weapons. I think there's a confrontation in our future between our civilization, I'll say that without embarrassment, a world that at least respects, if it doesn't always practice, the rule of law, and that has devised certain forms of diplomacy and certain systems of arms control to which the Iranians are legally signatories, and a regime that has the clearly expressed ambition to break out of and to trample all those conventions.
So I've been thinking about making this video for a long time, and I was just trying to find the argument I wanted to put forward. There's a lot of work done on people like Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, and there's also a fair bit of work done on how, I guess, the New Age atheist movement sort of transitioned into the anti-SJW movement, and in some ways also transitioned into the online alt-right movement. But I was trying to think of why this happened, and is there a through line? And upon doing more research and just the general stuff I know about people like Christopher Hitchens, it's clear that the through line is a lot of these New Age atheists were all very, very neoconservative in their foreign policy following 9/11. And I think it's this hysteria and total focus on Islam which made them susceptible to these arguments that often did veer into, I guess, racist territory, often did veer into problematic territory, and you can see why they often allied with people on the right, even, you know, Christians and other religious people on the right, because they felt like they were backing them up on their views against Islam. But before we go any further, if you like my content and want to support it, please like the video, maybe subscribe to the channel, and maybe share the video. Also check out my Patreon. Nearly all my videos are demonetized, so I don't actually make much money from YouTube, so any support is appreciated. And also check out my other social media links in the description. So for those of you who don't know, my channel actually started off as an atheist channel back in 2017. Ah, the good old days where we didn't have to worry about, I guess, impending climate disaster, worry about, you know, Trump and Brexit so much. Even though those things happened, the reality wasn't setting in, and of course we didn't have to worry about the coronavirus pandemic. But of course, as an atheist channel, I had watched and listened to a lot of Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, so I have, you know, a fair experience with them, but I was never comfortable with a lot of their arguments regarding Islam, mainly because to me they didn't make sense, and I'm going to get into all of that later. And of course, being my age on the internet at that time, they are quite influential people. I didn't have much of a problem with them. The anti-SJW, anti-Black Lives Matter stuff, especially with Sam Harris, did bother me. And again, I didn't agree with him, but I thought there was value to what he was saying. And unlike a lot of other atheists, maybe like Dave Rubin and some, you know, grifter types, I don't actually consider a lot of these people, I guess, dumb or stupid in the traditional sense, because they aren't unintelligent. It's just that the conclusions they draw are quite mind-boggling when you consider that they do their research a lot of the time. And I feel it really speaks to a lot of these atheists having a sort of Western supremacy complex, and I spoke about this a lot in the past. You know, people who talk about, I guess, the classical Western tradition, it's kind of similar to people who are religious who talk about, you know, the Judeo-Christian heritage of the West. In my mind, it's all one thing. West is the best, and everything else, I guess, is just alien and trying to infringe on all the progress we have made. So I mentioned it a bit in the beginning, but let's talk about, I guess, the rise to prominence of new atheism. Of course, people like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins were very prominent in some ways before 9/11, but after 9/11, these guys really, you know, shot right to the top, and they became celebrities in their own right. I was only 6 years old when 9/11 happened, but of course I've grown up in the war on terror. I'm 24 now, so throughout my whole teenage years and childhood, we have been in perpetual conflict with the Middle East, so I don't remember the total hysteria after 9/11, but I have researched it at university in my master's course. I, you know, did stuff about it, so, you know, The Clash of Civilizations by Samuel Huntington, very influential piece from the late 90s, which everyone started looking back on after 9/11, saying this guy got it, talking about the, you know, the clash between the West and the Islamic world, and it seems very influential for these atheist thinkers. So first, here's a couple clips of Christopher Hitchens, I think just before his death, talking about the existential threat that Iran posed, and I'm also going to play another clip where he justifies supporting the Iraq war because he was a massive, massive supporter of the Iraq war, and he basically never backed down from it, and he always supported it, and he wanted to take the Iraq war and replicate it in Iran. So let's have a look at this clip.
Saddam Hussein would still be the owner of Kuwait as well as Iraq. He'd have nearly doubled his holding of the world's oil, and he would have not been impeded in his pursuit of a nuclear weapon. If your policy of non-intervention had been followed, face it, that would have followed too. The Taliban would still be in charge of Afghanistan. Don't you feel a little reproach to your so-called high-principled anti-war policy? Would that really have led to less violence, less cruelty? I don't think so.
Well, since we're on that topic, do you think a nuclear Iran can be contained?
No. I don't think actually a theocratic Iran can be contained even without nuclear weapons. I think there's a confrontation in our future between our civilization, I'll say that without embarrassment, a world that at least respects, if it doesn't always practice, the rule of law, and that has devised certain forms of diplomacy and certain systems of arms control to which the Iranians are legally signatories, and a regime that has the clearly expressed ambition to break out of and to trample all those conventions. We already see it in the threats to their Arab Sunni neighbors in countries like Bahrain, in their export of violence, as far away as murdering Jewish community leaders in Argentina, or Kurdish exiles in Berlin and Vienna, for heaven's sake, or a novelist friend of mine living in London writing fiction. I think they've asked for a fight and should know that on those conditions they certainly will get one. I was at the Hezbollah rally, well, so were you, in Beirut a little while ago, and I couldn't but notice that the party symbol of Iran's main client in that country, Hezbollah, is now a nuclear mushroom cloud. In cartoon form, the cartoon is made up of words which, when decoded, constitute a threat to the Jewish state, the Jewish people. Well, I wouldn't want to look back and think, I wonder if I should have paid attention to a threat like that. You may say one is alarmist. I could give you also all the reasons why that could be a bluff. They don't have it, they just want you to think they do. It's a way of aggrandizing themselves. I know that's all partly true too, but behind it there's a reality, and the reality would be the emergence of a thermonuclear theocracy. The one thing we've, since I was at school, been lying awake worrying about what happens when apocalyptic weaponry is grabbed hold of, laid hold of by messianic totalitarian forces. Well, we are about to find out. If we want to run that experiment, they're ready to do it.
So the obsession with Iran and Islamic fundamentalists in Iran is pretty, I guess, unhinged in my mind for multiple different factors. And Iran and the obsession with, these sorts of countries isn't unique to Christopher Hitchens. But let's get into this quite quickly, just because I want to move on. So he talks about Iran basically being an existential threat to Western civilization. And he says civilization. So Iran is not civilized, okay, in his opinion, already laying the groundwork for, I guess, the general dehumanization of certain Muslim groups. And also, can we just talk about the right-wing hysteria towards Iran in general? This isolated country which has sanctions on it, which the US doesn't let join the international community, is apparently an existential threat despite being completely surrounded by Western and US bases, meaning they would probably lose any war they got into, especially with Israel, the US and Saudi Arabia. Now, this was back in the day where there was general freak out about Iran getting nuclear weapons, and Hitchens makes the point that Iran would be a massive threat without nuclear weapons because, they sponsor terrorism, they sponsor assassinations. Do you not know the Western history of what we've done in that region for, I guess, 2 centuries? The fact that the US and Britain have acted worse than Iran and act worse than Iran at the present moment is apparently lost on him, and all the awful things Iran does is an existential threat to civilization just because they are Muslims, I guess. Because in his mind, they're motivated by religious fanaticism. And we're going to move on to Sam Harris's view of this stuff. And it points to another general thing they push, is that Islamic fundamentalists, if they got the bomb, would use it because Muslims don't care about killing themselves. Because, you have suicide bombings, you have the promise of paradise, you have martyrdom. Apparently, to these guys, they're all unique concepts to Islam, and we know they're not. And historically, things like martyrdom have been seen in Christianity. But that clip was just to show you how these atheists are sort of Western supremacists, where the West doing things is not as bad as an Islamic country like Iran doing them. So let's go to Sam Harris next, and of course he wrote The End of Faith in 2004, right in the midst of the war on terror, a year after the Iraq war started. So let's get to some quotes from that. So, we are at war with Islam. It may not serve our immediate foreign policy objectives for our political leaders to openly acknowledge this fact, but it's unambiguously so. It is not merely that we are at war with an otherwise peaceful religion that has been hijacked by extremists. We are at war with precisely the vision of life that is prescribed to all Muslims in the Quran and further elaborated in the literature of the Hadith, which recounts the sayings and the actions of the Prophet. A future in which Islam and the West do not stand on the brink of mutual annihilation is a future where most Muslims have learned to ignore most of their canon. Such a transformation is by no means guaranteed to occur, however, given the tenets of Islam. And here is a really infamous bit. So, what would we ever do if an Islamist regime which grows dewy-eyed at the mere mention of paradise ever acquires long-range nuclear weaponry? If history is any guide, we will not be sure about where the offending warheads are or what their state of readiness is, and so we will be unable to rely on targeted conventional weapons to destroy them. In such a situation, the only thing likely to ensure our survival may be a nuclear first strike of our own. Needless to say, this would be an unthinkable crime, as it would kill tens of millions of innocent civilians in a single day, but it may be the only course of action available to us, given what Islamists believe. How would such an unconscionable act of self-defense be perceived by the rest of the Muslim world? It would likely be seen as the first incursion of a genocidal crusade. The horrible irony here is that seeing could make it so. This very perception could plunge us into a state of hot war with any Muslim state that had the capacity to pose a nuclear threat of its own. All this is perfectly insane, of course. I've just described a plausible scenario in which much of the world's population could be annihilated on account of religious ideas that belong on the same shelf with Batman, the Philosopher's Stone and unicorns. So again, just like Hitchens, Harris likes to paint Islamists, and you feel like he's hinting about Iran here, is totally unreasonable. And if they get a nuclear weapon, bang, they are launching a nuke, probably straight at Israel and the US. So they will totally destroy the world because they want to get to heaven. And this reflects a lot of my problem with these atheists, is that they sort of exist in a hypothetical world where every fundamentalist Muslim or every Islamist will follow the Quran to the letter every time. But also I feel these people have a really bad grasp of geopolitics. So let's say Iran got a nuke. Let's say even ISIS got a nuke back in 2015 when they had substantial territory. What would be the incentive for the leaders of ISIS, who are building a nation, or the leaders of Iran, who have a nation, to launch these nukes? Because what would happen to them, obviously, is in the case of Iran, Israel, with their secret nukes, would nuke them. America would probably nuke them. And there'd probably be a coordinated invasion to totally destroy Iran. They wouldn't have the capacity probably to end the whole world. So why would they do this? So in international relations, which I did my master's in, you have the realist school of thought, which is that there are no morals in the world, especially geopolitics. It's all just driven by power, and that's what keeps, things in check. So having a nuclear weapon in their arsenal, whether it be, ISIS or Iran, only benefits them because they can strengthen their position and, secure their nation state. It would not benefit them at all in, cold-hearted international relations to launch these nukes, because it would just undo all their work. And the threat of being totally destroyed quickly by Israel, by Saudi Arabia, or by the US is enough of a deterrent for them not to launch it. Why people like Hitchens, Harris, and the neocons in the US don't want countries like Iran to get a nuclear weapon is because it makes them untouchable from regime change wars. Just, look at North Korea now. There is no touching them because they have a significant nuclear arsenal, and they've created an image for themselves that they're very unstable. But just like with Iran, and in my opinion even a group like ISIS who wants a nation state, North Korea are not going to do a nuclear first strike. But these guys have convinced themselves that just because Iran is ruled by the mullahs and the Ayatollah, and that they believe a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, they're crazy enough to launch these nukes. Not to mention that the US government, under the last 2 Republican presidents, has been substantially run by evangelical Christians who want Israel to trigger a war with Iran to bring about Armageddon. Mike Pompeo, who served in the Bush administration and serves as the Secretary of State right now in the Trump administration, literally believes in that. He believes in things like the rapture and Armageddon. But it's always funny how New Age atheists were always pretty quiet on how fanatical these members of the highest levels of the US government were. While I wouldn't call a lot of it racism on Hitchens and Harris's part, I do see it as, Western supremacy. It's more that they see Muslims specifically as a group of people who take their religion way more seriously, and the religion is way more flawed, so therefore they are far more dangerous. But I mean, if we look at the last, 100, 200 years of human history, who has wrought the most destruction on the world? It's not Muslims and Islamic fundamentalists. It's white Christians in, the British Empire, in the American Empire, in the French Empire, Belgium Empire. These are the people who are doing these things. And if we go back even further, say the last 500 years, which, it's still true in the age of colonialism, a lot of these leaders of these countries were extremely religious, and they would act just as violently as Islamic fundamentalists. So how do you rationalize, those two things together? Again, I feel it is the influence of 9/11 and the hysteria of the war on terror and things like Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, which painted, the axis of evil, including a lot of Muslim countries, versus the West. And it's a battle over the future. It's the battle to secure Francis Fukuyama's end of history type world, where secular, liberal, capitalist democracy reigns and will be peaceful for the end of history, basically. So you can see from their rhetoric towards Muslims during the war on terror how it becomes fertile ground for the alt-right, and how it's not surprising where tensions with the Islamic world between the Western countries has ramped up, and obviously discrimination against Muslim minorities in Western countries, including the US and Britain, for example, have really ramped up. It's not surprising the alt-right pounced, and the alt-right became very prominent during things like, the rise of contemporary ISIS, the attacks in Paris, the attacks in Belgium, Donald Trump calling for a Muslim ban, and then New Age atheism found a new ally against Islam in the far right, particularly in America. But let's just dial it back a tiny bit to the YouTube scene. So I'm going to talk about the pipeline. So obviously people like Sam Harris, people like Dave Rubin, another atheist, or at least he was, maybe he's a Christian now because that's how much of a sellout he is, and other atheists on the platform, they all started as people who were, largely against Islam, and they would talk about general religion, but it was always focused on Islam. But what actually happened is they branched out of just talking about religion, and they branched into politics. So people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, people like Dave Rubin, they talk about the regressive left. They talk about SJWs, they talk about feminists, and how all these groups are just people who really hold the world back because we defend the indefensible. We defend, Islamic extremists, and we make sure that opinions like Sam Harris's, where he does show, Western supremacy, we ensure that opinion doesn't become dominant according to these people, because we're so outraged about any criticism or any critique of Islam or the Islamic world. And then you saw on YouTube how these people would swim in the same circles as the alt-right. So early Dave Rubin, 2016 Dave Rubin, had Tommy Robinson on his show, he had Milo Yiannopoulos on his show, and what did these guys talk about when they came on for Atheist Dave Rubin's long-form interview? They would talk about the threat of Islam. And we all know Dave Rubin just nods like a dog whenever people say stuff like that. But if you watch Dave Rubin's old videos, which I talked about in the past, it's clear that he does have a problem with Muslims, especially when he talks about Israel-Palestine, and that's one consistent with him. So it's no surprise that he found allies with these Western far-right types like Milo and Tommy Robinson to shit all over Muslims. And this blend of new atheism with online far-right personalities really racialized the whole issue. Like I said, I don't necessarily believe that Sam Harris is a racist in the traditional sense. And like Christopher Hitchens in his interview, he was talking about other Muslim groups that he was afraid for because of the rise to power of Iran. But this West versus East, this Orientalist view, this West versus Islam mentality obviously breeds a lot of racism, where you just see all brown people as a problem, all Muslims as backwards, you paint them all as a monolith, where every Muslim ever in the world shares the same beliefs as the most fundamentalist people in Al-Qaeda. And of course, I'm sure a lot of you know Muslims, I'm sure a lot of you have been to Muslim countries, and if you've been to multiple, you'll understand, just like Christian countries and the differences between them, there are many, many differences between Muslims throughout, the Middle East and the Gulf. But to a lot of new atheist types in the far right, if you look like an Arab, you're a Muslim, and you coming over to the West is you destroying Western civilization. And Sam Harris even said, that we shouldn't allow many Muslims to migrate to the West. So don't just take my word for it, let's hear from Sam Harris himself. So in a conversation with Majid Nawaz back in 2018, Harris said, "I think many people will feel this. What is the fucking point of having more Muslims in your society? It seems perfectly rational to say, we don't want any more, we have enough, and certainly increasing the percentage is not help to anyone who loves freedom of speech and anything else, any of the other liberal values. It's not worth the trouble, and if we can figure out some way to keep the number of Muslims down in any society, whether we're honest about this or whether we do this covertly, clearly it's rational to want to do this." So again, you can see how this language clearly lays fertile ground for the alt-right and far-right Christians to say, you know, these liberal atheists are saying, you know, we're not the threat. The Muslims are the threat, and we got to stop them immigrating to Britain, to America, or they're going to undermine our Western values, they're going to commit white genocide, and then before we know it, you know, Londonistan is going to come back, the whole of the country is going to look like that, no-go zones everywhere. So I hope I'm illustrating here how the Western supremacy that New Age atheism pushes from seemingly credible and smart people really gives fuel to the alt-right's arguments and pushes people down this pipeline. If you watch Sam Harris all the time, if you listen to Sam Harris, if you listen to his tirades against Muslims and Muslim immigration, if you listen to his tirades against Black Lives Matter or Antifa or the regressive left, if you listen to all of that, you're probably going to be more susceptible to Milo Yiannopoulos and Tommy Robinson talking about the migrant crisis, where Muslims are just flocking to the West and hoping to take it all over and undermine the hard-fought freedoms we've all fought for. And you're going to buy into it because you've been fed a consistent message of Western supremacy. So I feel like there's a direct connection between things that Hitchens and Harris says and stuff that, you know, groups like the Proud Boys talk about. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Please like the video, maybe subscribe to the channel. Check me out on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. Please check out my Patreon in the description. Also check out my Reddit, which is r/Kavernacle for my subreddit, u/Tommy Cahill for my personal Reddit. Also check out my Medium and my WordPress and my podcast. All of that good stuff is in the description. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.